Erik Lawson had built his family's warehouse distribution company into a national chain, but lately, something felt off. Complaints from workers about exhausting hours, staff quitting without warning, and a growing number of customer service failures had reached his desk. The reports from his district managers painted a picture of everything being under control, but Erik wasn't convinced. It wasn't always like this. When his father ran the company, employees stayed for decades. They felt valued. But now, Erik was getting emails from warehouse workers who were burned out, underpaid, and working in unsafe conditions. Something had changed. He needed to see it for himself. Disguising himself as a new trainee named Erik Lewis, Erik shaved his beard, dyed his hair a darker shade, and wore thick, rimmed glasses. The distribution centers were massive, and most of the front-line workers had never even seen his face before. It was the perfect cover. He chose to start at the busiest warehouse in the region, one that had the highest turnover rate. If something was wrong, he'd find out there. When he arrived, the manager, a stocky man named Mike, barely looked at him. "Trainee, great. We're short-staffed, so you'll be moving pallets today. Try not to break anything." The warehouse was chaotic. Workers rushed between towering shelves, forklifts beeped as they maneuvered through narrow aisles, and the air was thick with exhaustion. Erik joined a small group of workers loading boxes onto a conveyor belt. Within an hour, he was drenched in sweat. The workload was brutal. As he stacked crates beside two workers, he overheard their conversation. "I swear, man, I can't keep doing this," one of them groaned, shaking out his sore hands. "They just keep piling on more work, but they won't hire more people." The other nodded, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, and Mike doesn't care. He just tells us to toughen up. I've been pulling 12-hour shifts all week. My wife's pissed because I'm never home." Erik's chest tightened. Was this why turnover was so high? "Think they'll ever fix it?" the first guy asked bitterly. The second worker scoffed. "Nah, the CEO's probably sitting in his fancy office counting money. He doesn't care about us." Erik clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to tell them he did care, but that wasn't his role right now. He needed to see how deep this problem went. Just then, Mike stormed over. "What's with the talking? Get back to work. We're behind." The two workers exchanged a glance before silently returning to their tasks. Erik followed suit, but he wasn't done digging. By the end of the shift, his body ached and his mind raced. Something was seriously wrong with how this warehouse was run. He couldn't leave without getting the full picture, so he decided to stay longer. Erik stayed late, offering to help with the closing shift. He needed to see how things operated when the pressure was at its highest. The warehouse was supposed to run efficiently, but what he saw was barely controlled chaos. A worker named Lewis, who had been loading pallets all day, leaned against a crate, catching his breath. His shirt was soaked through, and his hands were raw from handling heavy boxes. "I don't get how they expect us to keep this up," Lewis muttered, shaking his head. "Every night it's the same thing. Never enough people, but they still want everything done faster." A younger guy, maybe in his early 20s, rubbed his sore shoulders. "They don't care about us, man. Mike only shows up when something goes wrong. Otherwise, we're just numbers to him." Erik had seen enough throughout the day to know they weren't exaggerating. He had spent hours lifting and moving inventory, and the pace was relentless. The break schedule barely allowed time to sit down. When Erik approached the supervisor's office, he caught a glimpse of Mike inside, leaning back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. A half-empty energy drink sat next to him. The guy barely looked like he'd set foot on the warehouse floor all day. Taking a deep breath, Erik knocked on the doorframe. Mike glanced up, not bothering to hide his irritation. "What do you want?" Erik kept his voice neutral. "Just wondering if there's a reason we're so short-staffed. A lot of the guys are struggling to keep up." Mike let out a dry laugh. "That's not my problem. Corporate won't approve more hires, so we work with what we have. If people can't handle it, they can leave." Erik studied him carefully. "A lot of them are thinking about it." Mike shrugged. "Then let them. Plenty of people need jobs." The complete lack of concern made Erik's stomach turn. He had expected inefficiencies, maybe some outdated systems. But this was pure disregard for the people keeping the company running. Later that night, as Erik helped close up, he overheard a conversation that made his decision even clearer. Lewis was talking in hushed tones with another worker, a woman named Jada who had been at the company for over a decade. "I heard another guy quit this morning," Lewis said. "Didn't even finish his shift, just walked out," Jada sighed. "It's bad, I've never seen it like this. Before Mike came in we had proper rotations, now he's squeezing every last bit from us." Lewis frowned. "You think corporate knows?" Jada scoffed. "They don't care. They wouldn't let this happen if they did." Erik clenched his jaw. He had heard enough. By the time the shift ended, his muscles ached, but his mind was sharper than ever. He wasn't just dealing with a workload issue. He was dealing with a management failure. Mike wasn't just ignoring the problem, he was the problem. The next morning, Erik arrived early, blending in with the incoming shift. He noticed the same weary expressions, the same sluggish movements as workers braced themselves for another punishing day. The warehouse floor was already buzzing with activity, but the energy was far from motivated, it was purely survival. As soon as he stepped into the loading zone, he spotted Lewis stretching his back, already looking drained despite the shift just beginning. Jada was nearby, adjusting her gloves before grabbing a dolly stacked with crates. Before Erik could say anything, Mike's voice cut through the air. "Pick up the pace, we're behind schedule already." Workers barely reacted. They were used to it. Erik fell into place, lifting and stacking alongside Lewis. His body was still sore from the previous day, but he pushed through. He wasn't here to take it easy. Midway through the shift, Jada motioned him over to help move a shipment of heavier boxes. As they worked, she glanced toward the supervisor's office. "Bet Mike hasn't stepped out once today," she muttered. "Just like yesterday." Erik nodded, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't ready to tip his hand. Then something happened that pushed him past his limit. A younger worker, maybe 19 or 20, struggled to lift a heavy crate onto a high shelf. He wobbled, gripping the box tightly, but his footing slipped. The crate tilted, threatening to crash down. Before Erik could react, Lewis lunged forward, catching the box just in time. But the sudden weight caused him to stumble, and he twisted awkwardly as he set it down. He immediately winced, clutching his lower back. Jada rushed over. "Are you okay?" Lewis waved her off, but his face was tense. "Yeah. Just pulled something." Mike finally emerged from his office, his expression one of pure annoyance rather than concern. "What now?" he snapped. Erik stepped forward before Lewis could answer. He heard his back catching a falling crate. "He needs a break." Mike barely spared Lewis a glance. "If he can stand, he can work." Jada's eyes flashed with anger. "He just saved that kid from getting crushed, and you're telling him to keep going?" Mike crossed his arms. "This is a warehouse, not a daycare. You think corporate's gonna care if one guy's sore?" "We have quotas to hit." Erik felt his patience snap. He had seen enough. Straightening, he met Mike's gaze. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Actually, corporate is going to care," Mike scoffed. "Yeah. And how would you know?" Erik reached up, pulling off his glasses and running a hand through his dyed hair. Recognition flickered in Mike's eyes, followed by a sudden stiffness in his posture. "I know," Erik continued, his voice steady, "because I am corporate." The warehouse fell silent. Workers nearby stopped what they were doing, eyes widening as murmurs spread. Mike's face drained of color. "You're Erik Lawson," he confirmed, "the CEO of this company, and I've spent the last 2 days watching you run this place into the ground." Jada's jaw slackened. Lewis blinked in shock. Even the younger worker, still recovering from nearly getting crushed, looked stunned. Mike opened his mouth, then closed it. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know, that's the problem," Erik interrupted. "You don't know and you don't care. I've seen the way you treat your workers. I've heard how you dismiss their concerns, and I watched you ignore an injury like it was nothing." Mike tried to regain his composure. "Listen, I was just trying to keep things running. We're understaffed and I've read the reports," Erik cut in. You've been understaffed for months because people keep quitting, and now I understand why." He turned to the workers, his voice carrying across the warehouse. "I came here because I wanted to see what was really happening, and what I've seen is unacceptable." Jada crossed her arms. "So what now?" Erik looked at Mike, his expression unreadable. "Now, things change." Mike's face twisted into something defensive. "You're overreacting. This is how warehouses operate. You think you can make it easier without hurting productivity." Erik didn't hesitate. "I don't think I know." "And you won't be part of it." Mike stiffened. "You can't just—" "I can," Erik said firmly. "And I am. Effective immediately, you're done here." The silence that followed was heavy. Then, slowly, workers started exchanging glances that weren't just shocked, they were relieved. Mike ground his teeth, but he knew there was no arguing. Without another word, he walked toward the exit, his steps heavy with defeat. Erik let out a slow breath before turning back to the workers. "From this moment on, things are going to change. And I'm going to make sure of it." The warehouse floor remained still as Mike disappeared through the exit. The weight of his departure hung in the air, but Erik knew there was no time for hesitation. He turned toward the workers, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. A younger man, the one who nearly got injured earlier, shifted uncomfortably. "So, what happens now?" Erik met his gaze. "Now we fix what's broken." Jada crossed her arms. "You're serious about that?" "Completely." Erik's tone carried no doubt, "But I need to hear everything." "What's really been going on here?" Lewis, still rubbing his lower back, exhaled sharply. "Where do we even start?" Jada glanced at him before stepping forward. "The shifts are too long and there aren't enough of us to keep up. We used to have rotation schedules, but those disappeared when Mike took over." A man with graying hair, likely one of the longest-serving employees, nodded. "Breaks got shorter too. They say they're the same on paper, but in reality, if we're behind, we get rushed back early." A woman adjusting her gloves chimed in. "Overtime used to be optional, now it's expected. If you say no, they cut your hours for the next week like it's punishment." Erik processed each statement, his mind already forming a plan. "And safety," Lewis scoffed. "What safety?" Jada gestured around them. "We used to have refresher training every month. Haven't had one in over a year. Some of the newer hires don't even know the right lifting techniques. That's why things like today happen." Erik nodded, absorbing each piece of information. "What about pay, morale?" The graying man sighed. "We used to get bonuses when we hit targets. That stopped too. Now it's just do more with less. People are burned out." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. Erik ran a hand over his jaw, his mind racing. He had come here suspecting problems, but the reality was worse than he imagined. Mike hadn't just been a bad manager, he had systematically broken down everything that made this a decent place to work. He straightened. "We make changes starting today. First, nobody is forced into overtime. It stays voluntary, and if we're understaffed, that's on management to fix, not you." Jada's eyes widened slightly. "You mean that?" 100%, Erik said. "Second, we bring back proper break times and they will be enforced. No more cutting them short to chase quotas." Lewis exchanged a glance with the older worker, both looking cautiously hopeful. Erik continued. "Safety training returns immediately. If you don't know proper lifting techniques or how to operate equipment, you'll be trained. No more guessing and getting hurt." A younger woman who had been quiet until now hesitated before speaking. "And hiring? Are we actually going to get more people?" "Yes," Erik's answer was firm. "I'll approve the budget for new hires myself. You shouldn't have to suffer just because leadership refuses to staff properly." The tension in the air started to shift. There was still skepticism, but now there was also a glimmer of relief. Jada studied him. "And what about accountability?" Mike wasn't the only one who knew what was happening. Some of the other supervisors let this slide too. Erik met her gaze. "Every manager in this warehouse will be evaluated. If they've been part of the problem, they won't stay." The graying man exhaled slowly. "That's different." "Because it has to be," Erik said. "I built this company with my father to be a place where people wanted to work. Somewhere they felt valued. What I saw here, that's not who we are, and it's on me to fix it." A long silence stretched between them before Lewis finally nodded. "Guess we'll see if you mean it." "You will," Erik said without hesitation. Over the next few hours, Erik stayed. He didn't retreat to an office or delegate the work to someone else. He walked the floor, spoke to more employees, and observed every process. He wanted to see firsthand what needed to change. By the end of the day, the exhaustion in his muscles was nothing compared to the clarity in his mind. He had work to do, and this was only the beginning. The following morning, Erik arrived before the first shift began. The warehouse was quiet, the usual hum of machinery and voices absent. He stood near the loading dock, arms crossed, taking in the stillness. Today was about action. A few workers trickled in, their expressions cautious. They had heard his promises, but whether they believed them was another matter. Jada was among the first to approach, her stance wary but interested. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "If you're really serious about fixing things, you'll need more than words," she said. Erik nodded. "That's why I'm here early. We're restructuring the entire workflow." Lewis arrived shortly after, moving stiffly but still reporting for duty. He gave Erik a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the changes they were expecting. A few of the supervisors had been called in for a meeting before the shift. Erik had no patience for excuses, and as they gathered in the break room, he could see uncertainty in their faces. Some knew they had been complicit in the warehouse's deterioration. Others had simply followed orders, afraid to push back. He leaned against the table, scanning the room before speaking. "Mike is gone," he said plainly, "and things are changing. Effective immediately, mandatory overtime is off the table. If anyone pressures workers into staying late, they're out." A younger supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "We've been short-staffed for a while. If people don't stay, how are we supposed to meet quotas?" "You hire more people," Erik said. "I've already approved it. We'll be bringing in new staff within the next 2 weeks. Until then, we adjust expectations. No more pushing workers past their limits." Another supervisor, a man who looked like he had been with the company for years, frowned. "Some of these guys have been working the same way for months. You think they're just going to trust that things are different now?" "They don't have to trust it today," Erik admitted, "but they will once they see the changes happen." One of the older supervisors, a woman who had largely stayed quiet, finally spoke. "Mike wasn't the only problem. Some of the managers let this happen because it was easier than fighting back." "What happens to them?" Erik met her gaze. "Every manager in this building is being evaluated. If they were enforcing bad policies, they'll be held accountable." The room fell silent. Some of them looked relieved, others less so. He gave them a moment before continuing. "We're also bringing back proper safety training. I don't want to see another injury because someone wasn't taught the right way to do their job." The younger supervisor exhaled sharply. "It's going to take a while for people to believe this isn't just talk." "That's why we start now," Erik said. By the time the first shift clocked in, the changes were already in motion. A training session was scheduled for later in the day. Break times were being enforced properly. And Erik had personally approved overtime pay adjustments to make up for the unfair scheduling of the past months. Lewis, who had been watching everything unfold, finally spoke up as Erik passed through the loading area. "You know, I wouldn't have thought a CEO would actually get his hands dirty like this," he said. Erik gave a small nod. "Neither did a lot of people. That's why we got here in the first place." Jada, stacking boxes nearby, glanced over. "Guess we'll see if this actually lasts." Erik didn't hesitate. "It will." The warehouse was far from fixed. Trust would take time to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, the workers weren't just pushing through another day. They were watching, waiting to see if the promises made would turn into reality. And Erik had no intention of letting them down.